the waters came, not as rain first, but as a decree. A divine reckoning so total, so absolute, that the very foundations of the deep were broken open. The sky became an ocean, the earth became a grave, and in those final hours, when the waters crept above the mountains and the screaming of 10,000 generations fell silent beneath the flood, something happened that no theologian in your Sunday school ever dared to explain. The giants died. Those monstrous, magnificent aberrations, the Nephilim, those beings born of a union that was never sanctioned by heaven, who had walked the earth with the weight of 2 worlds in their bones. They drowned like everything else. Their bodies sank. Their flesh returned to the corrupted ground from which it had been nourished. But the seeker must ask, and this is where the ancient texts open like a wound, where did their spirits go? Because every soul that has ever been poured into a body of flesh must go somewhere when that body is destroyed. This is the unbreakable metaphysical architecture of existence, a principle so foundational that even the enemies of heaven are bound by it. The body of a Nephilim perished in the flood, but the spirit of a Nephilim, that fractured, corrupted, half-divine and half-earthly essence, was given no place in the order of the afterlife. It was refused the descent of the righteous. It was barred from the ascent of the heavenly. It was left to wander, and wandering, the ancient texts tell us, it learned to hunger. Welcome to Bible Secrets, Hidden History. What you are about to encounter is not popular theology. It is buried scholarship, preserved in desert caves for 2,000 years, waiting. If you believe this history deserves to be preserved, that these truths deserve to reach those who seek them, a simple like on this video is all it takes. It costs nothing. It means everything. Now, let us go deeper. To understand what demons are, the seeker must first understand what the Nephilim were, not in the comfortable, sanitized summary of a seminary lecture, but in the full, terrible weight of what the ancient world believed it had witnessed. The Hebrew word at the root of Nephilim is nephal. It is a verb. It means to fall, to be cast down, to collapse under the weight of judgment. Some scholars have translated Nephilim as simply the fallen ones, but the ancient Aramaic traditions, particularly those preserved in the fragmentary manuscripts discovered at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, offer a far more disturbing reading. These were not merely beings who had fallen from grace. These were beings whose very ontology, whose fundamental nature of existence, had been constructed through transgression. They were the living embodiment of a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. In the Book of Genesis, chapter 6, the account is almost surgical in its brevity. The Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, descended. They took wives from the daughters of men, and from that union, the Nephilim were born. But the Book of Genesis is a summary. It is the headline. The full account, the one the ancient Hebrews knew, the one that circulated in the earliest communities of faith as authoritative scripture, is found in 1st Enoch. And 1st Enoch does not flinch. The Watchers, known in Aramaic as the Irin, a word that means precisely what it sounds like. The wakeful ones, the vigilant ones, the beings who do not sleep, who are assigned to observe the movements of creation. 200 of them descended upon Mount Hermon. The text records their oath, their pact of shared transgression, as though it were a legal document. They bound themselves to one another so that none could repent independently. The sin would be collective. The consequence would be total. The Irin, the Watchers, the wakeful ones who chose to close their eyes to divine law, their offspring, the Nephilim, were not merely large. The ancient traditions describe them as consuming the resources of the known world, then turning upon the animals, then, turning upon one another. The Book of Giants, one of the most remarkable discoveries among the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in Cave 4 at Qumran in fragments that date to the 1st century before the Common Era, portrays these beings in their final hours with something almost approaching tragedy. They dreamed, the text tells us. Two of the great Nephilim, Maheweh and the figure known as Ohia, experienced apocalyptic visions in the final days before the flood. In their dreams, they saw a garden and tablets being submerged in water and a figure whose radiance was blinding. They sent Maheweh across the wilderness to find Enoch, the scribe of heaven, to interpret what they had seen. And Enoch's answer, when it came, was without comfort. The end was decreed. There would be no ark for the Nephilim. No salvation was prepared for those whose existence was itself a violation of the created order. When the waters came, they came for them specifically, as much as they came to cleanse the earth of everything that breathed. And so the giants died. But here is the question that first Enoch refuses to leave unanswered, the question that separates this ancient text from every other flood narrative in the ancient Near East. What happened to what was inside them? In 1 Enoch, chapter 15, the seeker encounters one of the most theologically precise and most deeply unsettling passages in all of ancient religious literature. God himself is recorded as speaking directly to Enoch concerning the nature of the Nephilim's spirits. The passage deserves to be received slowly, because every word carries the weight of a divine legal pronouncement. The text declares that the Watchers, the Irin, were spiritual beings. They had their origin in heaven. They were fashioned from the substance of eternity. And because they were spiritual beings who had descended and taken on physical experience through their earthly wives and their earthly offspring, they do not require what physical beings require. They have no legitimate claim to earthly sustenance. But the Nephilim were different. The Nephilim were not spirits who had descended. They were flesh that had been infused anomalously, illegitimately, with a divine component. They were born into physicality. The earth was their native sphere. Their appetites for food, for sensation, for domination were formed in flesh and by flesh. And so when that flesh was destroyed in the flood, the spiritual component of the Nephilim found itself in a condition that had never been accounted for in the architecture of the created order. They were earthly spirits, not heavenly, not eligible for the fate of the Watchers, who were bound in chains beneath the mountains to await final judgment, a fate described with considerable detail in both 1 Enoch and in the Dead Sea Scroll fragments known as the Book of Giants. But not human spirits either, who had a designated place in the order of the afterlife according to Hebrew cosmology. The Nephilim spirits were, and this is the only adequate term, orphaned. They had been formed for a physical world. That world had been closed to them by divine decree, and they could not ascend because there was nothing in them that belonged to heaven. They were not the fathers, the Watchers, who had begun in heaven and chosen transgression. They were the children who had been born into transgression, formed in it, saturated with it, without ever having known any other condition. This is the ontological fracture, the crack in the structure of their being that made them what, according to 1 Enoch and the traditions preserved at Qumran, they became. The text is precise. These spirits were appointed to dwell upon the earth. They were given no body. They were given no rest. They were given no resolution. They were given hunger. Because a spirit formed for physicality, stripped of its physical vessel, becomes something driven by a singular and unfulfillable compulsion, the need to inhabit, to possess, to press itself into the experience of physical sensation through whatever vessel it can find. The New Testament scholar will recognize immediately where this trajectory leads. The Synoptic Gospels' accounts of demonic possession, the Gadarene demoniac, the boy at the foot of the Transfiguration Mount, the account of the 70 returning from their mission, describe entities who seek bodies, who panic at the prospect of being cast into the abyss, who beg not to be sent out of the region. These are not beings that speak the language of heaven. They speak the language of creatures bound to earth, desperate for earth, unable to conceive of existence apart from the physical world they were formed to inhabit. The Second Temple Jewish tradition, the tradition in which Jesus of Nazareth was raised, in which his earliest followers were formed, did not regard these entities as fallen angels. The fallen angels, the Watchers themselves, were already in their prison. They were not wandering. They were not possessing. They were bound, awaiting their judgment at the end of the age. The demons of the New Testament world, in the cosmology that the first-century Jewish reader would have brought to every passage, were understood to be precisely what First Enoch described: the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim, the wandering remnants of a race destroyed by flood, still pressing against the membrane between the spiritual and the physical world, still hungry, still driven by appetites that no longer have a legitimate form to satisfy them. They are not the cause of evil. They are its residue. The primordial corruption that produced them, the transgression of the Watchers, was the cause. But the Nephilim spirits are its lasting echo, still reverberating through the physical world, long after the flood waters receded and the mountains re-emerged beneath a sky that had forgotten what it once contained. The seeker may ask a question that is, in many ways, the most practically urgent question in this entire investigation. Why are they permitted to continue? If the flood was divine judgment, if the destruction of the Nephilim was a decreed act of cosmic cleansing, then why do their spirits persist in the world? Why has heaven not simply extinguished them? The answer lies in a dimension of ancient Hebraic and Second Temple legal theology that modern Christianity has almost entirely lost: the concept of spiritual jurisdiction, or what some ancient texts frame as a legal right to oppress. In the traditions preserved both in First Enoch and in a remarkable fragment from Qumran known as the Testament of Amram, as well as in the broader framework of Second Temple angelology, the physical world operates according to legal principles. The spiritual realm is not lawless. It is governed by the same divine order that governs everything else, and entities within it operate according to rights, jurisdictions, and boundaries that were established at specific moments in cosmic history. The Nephilim spirits were not extinguished at the flood, for the same reason that the Watchers were not immediately destroyed upon their transgression. The age of final judgment had not yet arrived. The divine calendar had appointed an end to their activity, but that end was not the flood. The flood was their physical death. Their spiritual dissolution was reserved for a later reckoning, described in First Enoch in terms that would find their echo in the Book of Revelation: a final binding, a final fire, a final silence. Until that moment, they retain what the ancient legal traditions understood as a conditional jurisdiction over the physical world, specifically over human beings who, through their own choices, open what the tradition might describe as a door. The ancient texts are careful here. These spirits do not possess unlimited authority. They operate within constraints, but they are permitted to oppress, to afflict, to inhabit where invitation, whether through ignorance, through sin, or through covenant with dark powers, has been extended. This is why the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the sectarians of Qumran, likely Essenes, who copied and preserved these texts as sacred, maintained such rigorous ritual purity. They understood themselves to be living on a battlefield whose true dimensions were invisible. Every act of purification, every prayer, every communal meal conducted according to the covenant laws was understood as a form of legal defense, a closure of the doors through which wandering spirits sought entry. The Damascus document, another remarkable text from the Qumran library, speaks of the spirits of Belial, the spirits of destruction, as actively prowling and seeking. The language is almost predatory. These are not abstract metaphors for psychological weakness or social corruption. In the cosmology of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, these were understood as real beings, real presences, with real capacity to afflict real human lives. The great irony, and the seeker should sit with this, is that the traditions which most carefully preserved this understanding were the very traditions that were driven to the margins of Second Temple Judaism and eventually suppressed entirely by the consolidating forces of both Rabbinic Judaism and early institutional Christianity, both of which found the cosmological complexity of the Enochic tradition too dangerous, too destabilizing, too resistant to the simplifications that institutional religion requires. The Book of Enoch was excised from the Hebrew canon. The Book of Giants was reduced to fragments in a cave above the Dead Sea. The understanding of demons as the orphaned remnants of a drowned race, the most ancient and most textually supported account of their origin, was replaced with a simpler narrative, easier to preach, easier to control, emptied of its terrifying precision. The seeker stands now at the edge of something very old. 2,000 years of accumulated theology have placed between us and the ancient world a series of translations, councils, canons, and institutional decisions, each one further obscuring what the earliest communities of faith actually believed, what they had inherited, what they feared, what they knew. But in the desert caves above the Dead Sea, the ancient record waited, patient as stone, indifferent to the centuries passing above it. And what it preserved is this: that somewhere in the long aftermath of the flood, when the waters receded and the earth began again, something was left behind. Not in the earth, not in the sea, but in the thin and invisible space between the physical and the spiritual, in that membrane where the two worlds press against each other, the wandering spirits of the Nephilim remained. They remained still, according to this tradition, not as mythological relics, not as the colorful metaphors of a pre-scientific age that we have since outgrown, but as presences, hungering, pressing, ancient beyond the reach of recorded history, formed in transgression and unable to depart from the world that formed them. The theologian may debate the precise cosmological mechanics. The archaeologist may argue over the dating of fragments and the provenance of manuscripts. The philosopher may engage the ontological questions about the nature of spirit and matter and judgment. But the ancient seeker, the one who sat by lamplight in the desert community of Qumran, who copied these texts with trembling care, who understood that they were not merely preserving literature, but preserving truth. That seeker understood something that our comfortable, well-lit modern world has worked very hard to forget. The past is not finished. The transgression of the Watchers cast a shadow longer than the flood itself. That shadow, in the language of the ancients, is what we call demonic. It is the unresolved echo of a catastrophe so ancient that no living memory contains it. It is the ontological residue of a race that should never have existed, pressing against the world that destroyed it, unable to leave, unable to rest, unable to become anything other than what it was in the moment of its death. Hungry, wandering, ancient, still here. In our next journey into these archives, we will examine the fate of the Watchers themselves, those 200 Irin who are described in chains beneath the mountains, their prison guarded by the archangel Raphael, awaiting a judgment that the ancient texts say has not yet arrived. What does it mean that beings of such power are still bound and not yet destroyed? What were they waiting for? And what, according to the Book of Enoch, happens when they are finally released? The archives hold the answer. We will open them together. Until then, seek carefully.